Do you really believe money can buy everything? Silence, dignity, even justice? Sit with me for a moment, because what I witnessed one autumn morning shattered that illusion forever. It was the day a man who owned half a city walked into my courtroom convinced that even the law could be purchased like another piece of real estate. By the time he left, he understood something no balance sheet could ever teach him. It was the fall of 1998, and Providence was alive with ambition. Steel beams clawed at the sky, old neighborhoods were disappearing overnight, and money flowed like a river that never ran dry. I was still a relatively young municipal judge then, idealistic, stubborn, and perhaps a little too certain that the law, if applied honestly, could still mean something in a world increasingly ruled by power. Most mornings were predictable: traffic violations, noise complaints, minor disputes between neighbors. But that morning, something shifted the moment the courtroom doors opened. Arthur Sterling walked in. You could feel the silence spread before anyone even turned to look. Conversations died mid-sentence. Papers stopped rustling. Even the air felt heavier. Sterling didn't just enter a room, he occupied it. He was a real estate titan, a billionaire whose name was etched onto hospitals, office towers, and museum wings. He had built a skyline, and somewhere along the way, he had come to believe he owned everything beneath it too. He didn't come alone. 3 lawyers in immaculate suits followed him, along with assistants carrying leather briefcases and a bodyguard who stood like a statue near the door. Sterling himself didn't acknowledge a single person, not the clerk, not the officers, not the citizens waiting for their turn. He moved like a man accustomed to being the center of gravity. And then there was Maria Silva, 72 years old, small, frail, wrapped in a worn coat, clutching a handkerchief like it was the only steady thing in her world. She sat alone at the plaintiff's table. No lawyer, no entourage, no power behind her name. Just a lifetime of memories tied to a small Victorian house in Silver Lake, built by her late husband brick by brick after the war. On paper, the case was simple: a building code violation. In reality, it was something else entirely. Sterling's company had been constructing a luxury condominium complex next to Maria's home. In the process, they had crossed onto her property, shattered part of her foundation, and buried her 40-year-old rose garden beneath rubble. When she protested, instead of compensating her, they sued her, accusing her of obstruction, attempting to force her out through legal pressure. That morning, Sterling wasn't just there to answer for violations. He was there because someone had dared to resist him. When I called the case, his lawyer stepped forward with polished arrogance. "This is a waste of time," he said. "Baseless claims from a senile woman unwilling to accept progress." I remember looking at Maria then. Her hands were trembling. Tears were forming, but she was trying desperately to hold herself together. And then came the moment that changed everything. The lawyer suggested we step into my chambers for a private discussion. He mentioned donations, equipment for the court, scholarships, generosity. It was subtle enough to deny, but obvious enough that everyone in that room understood what it meant. A bribe, offered in daylight, wrapped in politeness. I felt something rise inside me, not anger at first, but something deeper. The memory of my father, a milkman who worked before sunrise every day of his life, who taught me that a man without integrity owns nothing, no matter how much he has. So I refused, publicly. And that's when Sterling himself stood up. He didn't bother with politeness. He didn't pretend. "You know who I am," he said. "Take a recess, fix this, or your career won't survive it." The room went still. In that moment, it wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a test of the system, of the law, and of me. I looked at him, then at Maria, and I realized something very simple. If I bent, even slightly, then everything this room stood for would collapse. So I didn't. I warned him, told him to sit down or face contempt. For the first time in his life, someone had told Arthur Sterling no, and he listened, barely. What followed was testimony that stripped away every layer of his power. The city inspector confirmed the illegal excavation, the missing permits, the structural damage. Photographs showed devastation, not just property damage, but the erasure of something deeply human. Then Maria took the stand. Her voice shook at first, her English imperfect, but her truth was undeniable. She didn't talk about property values. She talked about her husband proposing in that garden, her son taking his first steps on that porch, her husband dying in the bedroom upstairs. "That house is not wood and brick," she said. "It is my memory." And in that moment, the entire courtroom shifted, because no amount of money could compete with that kind of truth. Sterling, however, didn't understand. When he took the stand, he didn't deny anything. He admitted it all, crossing property lines, ignoring permits, calculating fines as business expenses. Then he did something I will never forget. He pulled out a thick roll of cash and tossed it onto the witness stand. "That should cover it," he said. "Not just the damage, the law itself." That was the moment I knew a fine would mean nothing. It would only prove him right, that justice had a price, and he could afford it. So I changed the equation. I found him guilty, not just of violations, but of contempt, of attempting to bribe the court, of threatening judicial authority. And then I sentenced him. 30 days in jail, immediate custody, no bail. The reaction was explosive: shock, outrage, silence. His lawyer panicked. The courtroom gasped. But the most important reaction was his. For the first time, the certainty in his eyes cracked. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, he wasn't a billionaire anymore. He wasn't a developer or a kingmaker or a man with influence. He was just a man. And that sound, the click of steel, doesn't care how much money you have. The fallout came fast. Calls from politicians, pressure from powerful people, headlines calling me reckless, unstable, dangerous. Even the higher courts were dragged into it. But in the end, the sentence stood, and something unexpected happened. Inside that jail cell, stripped of his control, Sterling began to see the world differently. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, painfully, honestly. He wrote to me once, from prison, said he couldn't sleep, said for the first time in his life he could hear himself think. He had met people inside, people who had done far less and lost far more. And for the first time, he recognized himself not as a businessman bending rules, but as someone who had harmed another human being. He served all 30 days. When he came out, there were no cameras. Weeks later, Maria's home was repaired, her garden restored, carefully, respectfully, beautifully. No lawsuits, no publicity, just action, not redemption, not entirely, but change. Maria lived there for decades afterward. Her garden bloomed every spring, a quiet, living reminder that justice, when it holds firm, can protect even the smallest life against the largest force. People ask me if I was afraid that day. Of course I was. But fear isn't the measure of a judge. Courage is, because a courtroom isn't just a place where laws are enforced, it's where the balance between power and vulnerability is decided, case by case, moment by moment. Arthur Sterling walked in believing everything had a price. He walked out learning that some things don't. And that lesson had cost him more than money ever could.